So in his marvelous introduction to the American Happiness and Discontents, George Will notes that reading newspaper columns is an optional activity and an acquired taste. This is his sixth book of newspaper columns for a segment of time over the 50 years he's been doing this. It's the kind of book you pick up for a quick pop of mental stimulation and memory jog, as all the issues from 2008 to 2020 in all the categories. It's marvelous. Each essay sums up in just 2 or 3 pages a point of view you may not have had, but each essay is loaded with so many facts that make his arguments all the more compelling and really harder to refute. He cites data the way some writers use adjectives. Reading them reminds us all of the stuff we've gone through and how history repeats itself. Often a provocative conversation in this town even starts with, "Did you read George Will's column today?" And we are lucky in Philadelphia to have them in the Inquirer. But we're one of but 450 towns where people can wake up to what I'd call the willing belief of discontent. It all began in 1973 as a columnist for the National Review, then Newsweek, 15 books, some 6,000 columns for the Washington Post, as you know, a Pulitzer Prize, and the conservative ballast on the ABC political commentator shows. Clearly, he was the most erudite. But he comes by that honestly, given a father who was a professor of philosophy and a mother who was the editor of children's encyclopedias, plus his own education. At 17, Will studied religion at Trinity College, then he went on to Oxford for a degree in philosophy, politics, and economics, and from there in 1968 to Princeton for a master's degree and PhD in politics. Tonight, we'd like to welcome back to the stage of the Free Library the man who recently said in the late 1960s the phrase Republican academic was not quite an oxymoron. I ask you to welcome with me the irascible, the inimitable, Dr. George Will. Thank you.
I wouldn't be a columnist if it weren't for, a senator's jersey. If it weren't for Philadelphia, I'll have to explain that. I would have been a lawyer otherwise, but when I left Oxford, I applied to Harvard Law School and Princeton in philosophy. And I chose Princeton because it was midway between 2 National League baseball parks. I'm old enough to remember when it was Shibe Park, before it was Connie Mack Stadium, before the Vet, and before Senior Citizens Ballpark, as they used to say. There can't be a word in the English language with a nicer resonance than library. And the resonance gets better as the new media ruin our lives. I'm told I have a Facebook page. I've never seen it. I've never tweeted, and I don't know how, and I wouldn't know where to look for a tweet. Books require a kind of engagement, a kind of active engagement that Netflix doesn't require, that 240 characters or whatever it is nowadays doesn't require. It's just a different experience, and it has, I'm quite convinced, different neurological effects in wiring the brain. As we're going to find out to our sorrow, when we have an entire generation raised on this stuff. I've often said that I only write about politics to support my baseball habit, which is so severe. My wedding ring, which I designed myself, has the Major League Baseball logo on it, which is my way of telling my wife that in my heart she ranks up there close to baseball. But then I actually proposed to her at a cinder block that was going to be where home plate is when they were building Camden Yards. Aren't I a romantic? I want to sort of riff tonight on what I'm doing here. By the way, I went to Princeton. This is a terrible year to bring up to Phillies fans, in 1964. Boo, yes, I know, Gene Mauch, short and bunning day after day. When I started as a columnist, I asked Bill Buckley the question that I now know is the most frequently asked question of a columnist, which is, how do you come up with things to write about? Bill said, the world irritates me 3 times a week. The world irritates or amuses me or piques my curiosity endlessly. There's never, I think, been a day when I didn't have 5 different things I wanted to write about. I don't understand people who say writing is painful. Red Smith, a great sports columnist, was of the it's painful school. He said, writing, nothing to it, you just open a vein and bleed. That strikes me as silly. I can't think of anything more fun than putting sentences together. Now, what I do, and you said it was optional, reading a syndicated column is one of the most optional things in the world, which is why most people don't do it. But that's fine. A majority of Americans don't read newspapers. A minority of the minority of newspaper readers read the op-ed pages. But that to me is exhilarating and liberating because it means those who come to read it are a small, intellectually upscale, self-selected audience who have a mental pantry full of ideas and opinions and information and history. They're argumentative by nature, which is why they come to read people like me. And it's so that you can assume a lot, and you know you're talking to a small group of people, and that's just fine. In the book, I've got the 2 columns that cause most commotion. Was one on my son, John, turning 40. John was born on my birthday in 1972 with Down syndrome. And the next morning, a hospital official, Georgetown University Hospital, came and said, well, the first question you have to ask, are you going to take John home? And I said, well, we rather thought that's what people did with their children. But at that point, it was still acceptable to put Down syndrome children up for adoption or even to institutionalize them at very young ages. The life expectancy, not surprisingly, of Down syndrome people when John was born 49 years ago was 20. Because when you warehouse people and you don't stimulate them, that's what happens. John will be 50 next year. He works in the Washington Nationals clubhouse, which means he gets up in the morning and goes to a major league ballpark, which means he has a better job than his father has. It's a study of the evolving standards of decency, to use language from the Supreme Court, that are a fact. We have just in so many ways improved in the United States and in our treatment of people. And John is an example of that. The second most in fact, a more commented upon column is my full-throated denunciation of blue jeans. Now, I know I'm insulting some people here in the audience, no doubt. It came about because I got tired of sitting in airport concourses and watching people go by. There'd be a father who's 42 and a son who's 12, and they're dressed exactly the same way. Running shoes, blue jeans, T-shirts, baseball cap. And if mother's there, she's also wearing blue jeans. And it kept occurring to me that I thought there was a time, if memory serves, when we dressed differently for different stages of life. It was a way of signifying that we didn't want to be children forever. We wanted to grow up. And this led me to wonder how we came to have the kind of children we have. I know it sounds like an old fogey saying, oh, kids these days. And I've raised 4 children and enjoyed all of them and still do. But it seems to me that we're producing bubble-wrapped children nowadays. Parents have bought into the idea of parental determinism. That is, that if you're a sufficiently skillful parent and really good at parenting, something radical happened in the United States when the noun parent became a verb. We now parent people. And I think that it's because we began to look upon parenting as something like differential calculus, extremely complicated, but if done well, very rewarding. If you do it just right, your children can go on to Princeton and Goldman Sachs or whatever peculiar arc you want their lives to take. And the result of this is a kind of minute, oppressive helicopter parenting, to use a phrase that's quite common now. When I was growing up in Champaign, Illinois, right after the Second World War, in the late 40s and early 50s, Get up in the morning in the summer, barge out the back door. My mother would say, come back for lunch if you want lunch, otherwise come back at dinner. And we'd be gone working out with swarms of children of all ages, our difficulties and having fights and squabbles and figuring out how to solve problems like that without adult supervision. The process was then called growing up. Instead, something has now happened. We so minutely superintend the spare time, I won't call it leisure time, of our children, and we protect them in a kind of bubble-wrapped childhood. And this might explain why so many of them get to college and they're eager to not have freedom of speech, but freedom from speech. They're eager to have safe spaces where they can hover while bias response teams from the administration filter about the campus, trying to stamp out microaggressions. I don't know how we produce these kids, but it must have something to do with the way we now parent people. And that's why we have higher education of the sort we have. Of course, it's higher than what it occurs. But I don't know if you've seen that you can buy a T-shirt that says college, those magical 7 years between high school and your first warehouse job. But what's interesting is that higher education is now at the center of an argument in this country over meritocracy and the allocation of wealth and opportunity on the basis of merit. I don't know if you realize how this started. It really started with James Conant, who at age 40 in 1933 became president of Harvard. He went on to have an illustrious career as science advisor to Franklin Roosevelt. He was at Alamogordo when the Trinity test occurred on the first atomic bomb. But what Conant did was take Harvard and change it from a provincial Boston, stuffy, utterly mediocre institution, educating the sons of other Harvard alumni, the Boston Brahmins particularly, and turn it into a meritocracy with scholastic aptitude tests. One purpose of which, frankly, was to get Jews into Harvard. Jews had been treated the way Asian Americans are now treated by Harvard, but that's another story. Well, no, it's not another story. It's the same thing. I'll say something about that. Jews were considered, as Asians now are, as not somehow compatible with the Harvard sense of sociability. And Conant, by bringing in scholastic aptitude tests, combining them with high school transcripts, the two objective measurements, opened Harvard to a wider variety of talents. Harvard now does have a problem with Asian Americans because a document discovered in the trial that some Asian Americans brought against Harvard for discrimination, a document discovered from the Harvard admissions department said, if we admitted solely on the basis of the two objective criteria, high school transcripts and standardized tests, Harvard's freshman class would be 43% Asian American and 1% African American. Now, no one wants that. Harvard doesn't want it. No American should want that, have our elite institutions not look at all like the rest of America. But these are complicated matters that I talk about in my book, about how you allocate wealth and opportunity. If you don't do it on some form of objective merit, then it's going to be done politically. It's going to be done by the government, and government is politics straight through. Now, equality of opportunity is an extraordinarily complicated business because it is so easy to transmit family advantages. And frankly, we want families to be devoted to transmitting their advantages. So we want families that focus on the welfare of their children, but it makes it very difficult. It's been said that the least diverse classes in the United States are SAT prep classes, which are instruments by which advantaged families pass on their advantages. Now, this matters to me because I'm an American conservative, which means I am a classical liberal. It's too late in the day to sort out the terminological train wreck that we have produced in this country, but it goes something like this. Conservatism was born in Europe in reaction against the French Revolution. It became articulate through Edmund Burke. And it was basically a reaction in defense of hierarchy and stability. And therefore, it has been tainted forever by blood and soil, thrown and altar, ethnic tendencies in European conservatism. American conservatism has been very different. It's been said that the story of the Bible, reduced to one sentence, is God created man and women and promptly lost control of events. American conservatives like that. We don't want events controlled. We want the spontaneous fecundity of a free society, the spontaneous order of people as individuals and as groups of individuals cooperating together with minimal state oversight. Now, when I say I'm a classic liberal, what that means is this. I believe there is, and this is see, people say, what do you want to conserve? You conserve. We want to conserve the American founding, which is 3 propositions. First, there is a constant human nature. We are not just creatures that acquire whatever impress the culture we happen to be in puts upon us. Second, because there is a human nature, there are natural rights. Rights that are essential to the flourishing of individuals of our nature. Third, therefore, it is the purpose of government to secure those rights. First come rights, then comes government. The most important word in the Declaration, how many blocks from here was it written? The most important word in the Declaration is secure. We hold these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal, endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, and governments are instituted to secure those rights. Third proposition, therefore you need a government strong enough to protect the rights, not so strong to threaten them. Therefore, you need the Madisonian structure of a separation of powers. People are always complaining, geez, our federal government's unwieldy, doesn't work crisply and nimbly and efficiently, to which Madison would have said, damn right. We planned it that way. 3 branches of government, 2 branches of the legislative branch, each with different electoral rhythms and different constituencies, vetoes, veto overrides, supermajorities, judicial review, all kinds of ways to slow the beast down, to filter public opinion, to refine it, to make it worthy of majority rule. See where I'm going here, I hope, which is, if you want to know what conservatism is, it's everything populism isn't. Populism in a way is H.L. Mencken's definition of democracy is the belief that the people know what they want and deserve to get it good and hard. Populists believe that the voice of the people is self-ratifying, that it is clear, that it ought to be translated directly into public policy without being filtered through institutions and refined by representation. No, it should be imposed by a president who's a tribune of the people in the Jacksonian manner, a tribune of the people, unbeholden to and unrestrained by institutions. That's why the first real theoretically progressive president, Woodrow Wilson, was the first American president to criticize the American founding, which he didn't do peripherally, he did root and branch. He said, separation of powers was all very well once when we were a simple country with 4 million people living within 20 miles of Atlantic tidewater, but now we're a continental nation united by steel rails and copper wire. And because society is more complex, government needs to be more complex. That's the classic progressive non sequitur. It's exactly wrong. The more complex society gets, the more it is the fatal conceit, to use Hayek's great phrase, it is the fatal conceit to believe that government can know enough about this complex society with hundreds of millions of people making billions of decisions a day, government can't know what it's doing, literally cannot know what it's doing. And therefore, it seems to me, the classic liberal has a kind of leg up. See, the founders had a catechism. What is the worst outcome of politics? The answer is tyranny. What is the worst outcome of democratic politics? The tyranny of the majority. Madison's genius solution, the Madisonian revolution in democratic theory, was this: don't have majorities. Don't have, that is, stable, potentially tyrannical majorities. Have shifting, unstable coalitions of minorities. Therefore, Madison said, hitherto, everyone who thought, and there weren't that many, who thought democracy would work, said it would only work in a small face-to-face society, like Rousseau's Geneva or Pericles' Athens. You could walk across in a day because a small society would be homogeneous and would not have factions, and factions were thought to be the enemy of democracy. Madison said, no, a saving multiplicity of factions will save democracy by producing these unstable majorities. And therefore, he says in Federalist 10, we need an extensive republic. And the first duty of government is to protect the different and unequal capacities of acquiring property, because that will produce different factions. Then, he said in Federalist 51, we must have throughout our system the process of supplying by opposite and rival interests the defect of better motives. Senators should worry about the Senate. They should be jealous of the Senate's powers. Same's true of the members of the House. The judiciary should be jealous of its own rights and prerogatives. That way you will have some kind of equilibrium. The great tragedy of modern American government is the modern presidency, which is untethered from any control, so far as I can tell, partly because Congress has been eager to shed its responsibilities, and therefore its need to make difficult decisions and give the power to the presidents. In my 50 years of doing this, and you'll see this in my book, there's a long chapter, there's a chapter on culture and parenting and all the rest, but there's also a chapter on the judiciary. In my 50 years, I've changed my mind about some things, but never more dramatically than I've changed my mind about the role of the judiciary. Conservatives for many years, recoiling against the somewhat freewheeling and sort of non-constitutional reasoning of the Warren Court, said we're for judicial restraint. We're for majorities ruling at all times. Oliver Wendell Holmes was a great example of this. He said, if the American people want to go to hell, I will help them. It's my job. My job is to get out of the way of majorities and give majorities free sway. Well, another, if I may, biographical digression. I grew up in Champaign, Illinois, midway between Chicago and St. Louis, Lincoln country. According to local lore, it was in the Champaign County Courthouse that Lincoln, at that time a prosperous traveling railroad lawyer, Lincoln learned in 1854 that Illinois Senator Stephen A. Douglas had succeeded in passing through Congress the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was a legislative attempt to solve the big question of the day, which is, what do you do about slavery in the territories? Slavery is established in the states. Everyone has agreed was the state's business at that point. But what about the territories, which were the federal government's responsibility? Could people take slaves into the territory and have them protected by territorial law? Could they ban slavery in the territories? Stephen A. Douglas's answer was, vote it up or vote it down. Popular sovereignty in the territories. Vote it up, vote it down was a matter of moral indifference, said Stephen A. Douglas, because the important moral point was that majorities should rule. Lincoln's recoil against this launched his ascent to greatness. Lincoln said America is not about a process, majority rule. America is about a conditioned liberty. Now, if you believe that, as I certainly do, You believe that the very purpose of a Bill of Rights, and really of a Constitution itself, is to put certain things beyond the reach of majorities. That is a phrase from the second of the flag salute cases. Opinion written by Justice Jackson, who was Attorney General before he was a justice, and then was the head of the American team at the Nuremberg war crimes trials. In 1939, in the great state of Pennsylvania, a case called Minersville v. Gobitis came to the Supreme Court. In 1939, the court ruled that it was all right for the state of Pennsylvania to require Jehovah's Witness students in primary school to salute the flag, although they considered that sacrilege. War clouds were lowering over the world in 1939. There was a great concern with national unity in our country, and the opinion saying it was all right for Pennsylvania to require this was written by a Jewish emigre from Vienna, Felix Frankfurter, who had seen in his native Vienna school children treated differently because on the basis of their religion, and he thought that shouldn't happen here. Understandable. Just 4 years later, in 1943, in West Virginia v. Barnett, during wartime, the Supreme Court reversed itself and said, no, the very purpose of a Bill of Rights is to place certain things beyond the reach of majorities, above the vicissitudes of politics, to protect individual rights. This is, and I have decided, and those who read the book will see a lot of instances of where if the judiciary will not protect minority rights, no one will. Now, another thing you're going to read in the book is a kind of unapologetic elitism. I don't understand the criticism of elites. We have good elites, we have bad elites, of course, but the question in any society is not whether elites shall rule, but which elites. And the challenge of democratic politics is to get broad consent to worthy elites. Worthy elites in representation, worthy elites in presidents, but face the fact that we actually want elites to be elite, to be special. When Robert Taft was senator from Ohio, he died in the 1950s, he was Mr. Republican. He was the son of William Howard Taft. And someone once said to his wife, Mrs. Taft, about the Ohio senators, is your husband a common man? She said, good God, no. He was first in his class at Yale, first in his class at law school. The people of Ohio wouldn't want a common man to represent them. That's kind of bracing, I find, to have someone talk like that. As I said, what do people want? Say, no, we'd really like some mediocrity if we could only find some. I don't think we have any trouble finding mediocrity, but the problem is that this anti-elitism, this populism, often bleeds into envy as an animating principle. And envy is no fun. Let me tell you, envy is the only one of the 7 deadly sins that doesn't give the sinner even momentary pleasure. I'm going to pause while you go down the list. You know, Mark Twain could be a great scourge of the rich. He gave the name to the Gilded Age. It was the title of one of his less successful novels. But also, one of his best friends was a hugely successful executive of Standard Oil, which was the great Satan of its day. And a journalist once went up to Twain and said, Mr. Twain, don't you think your friend's wealth is tainted? Twain said, you're damn right, it's doubly tainted. It tain't yours and it tain't mine. Envy is an unpleasant thing. And it leads to all this kind of animosity against people who've made lots of money. How many, I'd have to have a show of hands here. How many people here own an Apple product? I see a show. Thank you. And now another show of hands. How many of you resent the fact that Steve Jobs died a billionaire? Very good, very good. No, quite right. Steve Jobs created far more wealth and far more value. He probably reaped maybe 1% of the value of what he created and all the enormous benefits that we've all derived from this thing. Envy just, well, no good can come of it because it bleeds into a kind of rancid, toxic dislike of, often of excellence. Story is told, another Pennsylvania story, come to think about it, that Andrew Carnegie was in his office one day and he agreed to meet with a young man who was a socialist, and he was very big on redistribution of wealth. And he came in and said, Mr. Carnegie, your great wealth should be distributed among the people of the world. Carnegie said, all right. He summoned an aide, and he said, how many people are there in the world? And go divide my wealth by that. The young man came back and gave his answer to Carnegie, and Carnegie gave the young socialist gentleman 16 cents. That's your share of my wealth. Another bracing moment. Yeah. Well, there's so many ways of making democracy go wrong, of celebrating presidential Caesarism, of becoming impatient with the Madisonian architecture of government. There's so many ways to lose faith and break our faith with the framers of this great nation's institutions, that it seems to me a stance, a mental stance that makes sense, that I think you will find in my book, is what I would call intelligent pessimism, not fatalism. Fatalism means nothing you can do about it, but pessimism means you should be alert. Remember that in 1776, there were two great books published. One was The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, which is a great product of the Scottish Enlightenment, great belief in the rationality of markets and of society organized around principles of free exchange. But the other book published that year was the first volume of Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And Gibbon struck a note with our framers, who read deeply. Before Madison came here for the Constitutional Convention, he asked his friend Jefferson over in Paris to send a trunkload of books, which he did, and Madison read them. And they read Gibbon, and they worried about the fact that the record of republics was not encouraging. They all had one thing in common, and they all failed. So intelligent pessimism is something I recommend. Pessimists, I'm one in good standing, they actually have it pretty well, because a pessimist is either always being confirmed in his beliefs or pleasantly surprised. So it's a good way to be. Lincoln, one of the great phrases of Lincoln, and it's actually from his first great speech to the Young Men's Lyceum of Illinois, was the silent artillery of time, he said, is going to level most of our institutions. I think that's right. The silent artillery of time is always firing, and it takes work to preserve things. But there's something exhilarating about it. I know that viewed from a distance, Washington looks messy. Well, democracy is messy. A woman elected to the British House of Commons a few years ago, in her first speech, said very memorably, I thought, she said, democracy is like sex. If it isn't messy, you're not doing it right. Behave. And I think it's worth bearing that in mind. We shouldn't have aesthetic judgments about democracy. It's not that it's pretty, it's that it's wholesome and it works, it has its messy sides, and all of that I know. And I do know that the first rule of economics is that scarcity is real. There's not enough to go around, hard choices have to be made, scarcity is real. The first rule of politics is to ignore the first rule of economics. And we're doing that with a vengeance nowadays. But basically, at the end of the day, I can't help but have a kind of cheerfulness break out. Winston Churchill, who loved our country as much as he loved his American mother, said the American people invariably do the right thing after they've exhausted all the alternatives. I think we're fairly far down the list right now. But I also think that we remain a Lincolnian country in this sense. Lincoln in 1859, with disunion ripping the country apart, gave a talk to a Wisconsin, the precursor of the state fair, which he told the story of an Oriental despot who summoned his wise men and gave them an assignment. He said, I want you to come back, but not until you have designed a proposition. It can be carved in stone to be forever true and forever in view. They came back a few weeks later, and the proposition they had was, this too shall pass away. Lincoln said, how chastening in times of pride, how consoling in times of sorrow, but it need not be true if we Americans cultivate the moral and intellectual world within us as assiduously as we cultivate the physical world around us. What I try to do in my humble little craft of writing columns is to help with that cultivation. I like to think I'm doing what I trained to do when I trained at Princeton to be a professor of political philosophy, which I briefly was. And that is to discern the large nugget of principle that exists in all the arguments we have and all the arguments that are worth having. Now, I've talked too long. You're probably feeling the way Jeff Torborg did when he was managing the White Sox. He went out one day to take the pitcher out of the game, and he got to the mound. The pitcher was Jimmy Kern. And Kern said, Skipper, I'm not tired. And Torborg said, Jimmy, we know you're not tired, but our outfielders are. So on that note, I shall subside, and I welcome your questions.
I think I've heard you say in the past that you do not think Donald Trump will run again for president. Do you still feel that way?
I will travel vast distances to avoid talking about Donald Trump. I don't know. I'm sure he doesn't know. Forethought is not his strength. Not sure what it is, his strength. But if Mr. Biden seems very weak, as he might, and if the Democrats have an arduous choice to make against Kamala Harris, who is not well liked and not well regarded, and who dropped out of the Democratic presidential scramble 62 days before the first votes were cast in Iowa, Trump will be very tempted. And if this country were to have a race against an 82-year-old incumbent president and a 78-year-old repudiated president, I shudder to think. But I don't think that'll happen. The wish being father to the thought, perhaps, but that exhausts my willingness to talk about the 45th president.
Do you feel that the decline in newspaper readership has affected American democracy?
Yes, it surely has. The vast collapse across the country of local newspapers means that the local newspapers don't cover local issues, and so people become obsessed with national issues. You know, the saying is all politics is local. All politics today is national. Well, just look at the Virginia race that will be decided tomorrow. And people then, to get their national news, they don't go to the newspapers, they go often to cable television, which is awful. I have worked for both Fox and MSNBC, and I can tell you there's not a dime's worth of difference between them in terms of their business model. It is feed their angry base. And it encourages people to live in their intellectual silos. It makes us all susceptible to confirmation bias, that is receptive only to information that confirms our pre-existing beliefs. Now, here's the good news. There are 331 million people in this country, and at any given moment, 325 million of them are not watching cable television, not listening to talk radio. They're raising children, cleaning the gutters, mowing the lawn, and getting on with life. But we have lost, there's an excluded middle here, where people can talk and argue in civilized ways. And yes, the decline of local media is part of the problem.
I wanted to ask you about James Madison. I am a fan. When I was teaching American government, I would always ask students who the main architect of the Constitution was, and I rarely got a correct answer. I am such a fan, I have right next to my Carlos Ruiz bobblehead doll, I have a James Madison bobblehead doll. I've recently read a biography by Noah Feldman about Madison. I really think that somehow we Madison fans and appreciation of our Constitution and the structure of our Constitution, maybe we should start a publicity campaign about James Madison. So I didn't know whether you wanted to get on the bandwagon and start that campaign.
There's no question that civic education in a way should begin with Madison. The good news is there's a voracious appetite in this country for really good biographies from the founding era. Ron Chernow rescued, before he rescued Grant from ignominy, he rescued Hamilton. Tremendous biographies now of Jefferson and Washington and Hamilton and all the rest. They're out there, and the American people have a great appetite for this. But civics education is a neglected child in this country. And it's not easy to appreciate the American system because it's not simple. It's not simple because it was not designed by simple-minded people. They understood that complexity is a virtue in government, particularly for a continental nation with vast regional differences and ethnic differences and racial differences and all the rest. The problem of politics in ancient Athens or modern America is getting people of different views to live together amicably. And for all the hoo-ha about American strife and discord, I think we do a pretty good job of it. We have made astonishing progress in race relations. 60 years ago, there weren't any African-American players in the Southeast Conference. SEC football is as close as we come to an established religion in this country. Today, the head referee is an African-American, often bossing around the players of Alabama and Mississippi, penalizing them, throwing them out of the game. It's wonderful. It's just a vivid tableau of American progress. But start with Madison. Go ahead.
You've highlighted the polarities that exist in this country. How do we get away from that and toward all these great violent diversions, vocally violent diversions, to come to some general consensus and reestablish our centrality?
That's an excellent question, and it vexes all of us. But here's the beginning of hope, if you want. I don't usually dispense hope. But looking on the bright side, as I am disinclined to do, the very fact that the 45th president could have had such a curdling effect on the country is ominous because it tells you what one man can do, one demagogue can do. But the good news is that if that kind of person can do it, a better person can move us in the other direction. I believe the country is ready, is ripe for an adult who comes forward and says, deep breath, everybody. As Lincoln said in the last paragraphs of his first inaugural, we are not enemies, we must not be enemies. He was saying this at a time when 7 states had already voted to secede. Calm down, the country's ready for that. Americans are not an angry people. There are pockets of anger, stoked by the cable television. But most Americans are just not like that. So we need different tone-setting people in politics. Because, see, one of the vexing things is, in the 19th century, when we were at each other's throats and eventually killing each other in 600,000 lumps of people, we were arguing about things you could at least address legislatively. What to do about slavery in the territory, Fugitive Slave Act, etc. People could say, we want this. How do you assuage the anxieties of, I'll say his name, the Trump voters? How do you pass a law? That's why the Republican Party, of fragrant memory to me, is in a sense not a political party anymore. The Republican Party is a grievance machine. It doesn't say you have these problems, we have these legislative proposals. That's not it. It's a point-scoring grievance machine. But that can be changed with better people.
When a substantial portion of the American public, a third of Republicans, don't believe in elections or the outcome of the elections, when you cannot reason with people, how can you put forth reasonable arguments knowing that people don't listen to reason, they listen to cable TV, or they listen to who they want to listen to?
My answer sounds banal and Pollyannish, but there's no getting around. You have to have different people. We've got to get better people in public office. And by the way, I mean, I've got no brief for the Republican Party, which I used to be a professional member of and left more than 5 years ago. But they didn't start it. People have been questioning. McAuliffe, running in Virginia, was a big Clinton operative. He said Bush didn't win the election in 2000. Clinton and other people said that the 2016 election was tainted. McAuliffe is campaigning in Virginia with Stacey Abrams from Georgia, who says the election she lost by 50,000 votes was stolen in Georgia. It's becoming a bad habit. And not just the bad habit of Republicans, although you're right. I mean, to have 70% of Republicans basically accept that argument, which is terrifying. Because the heart of democracy is willing to accept electoral defeat.
What do you attribute all the hostility that we've recently seen at the local school board levels, the issues on mask mandates and vaccine mandates and critical race theory? What do you attribute all that to?
I think there are a lot of reasons. I'll tell you one thing, one contributor to this is during the pandemic, when there was a lot of virtual learning, a lot of parents heard stuff coming through their children's computers from their school teachers that they didn't like to hear. And a lot of them were quite right not to like what they were hearing, which was a kind of political propaganda from politicized representatives in education K through 12 that partakes of a common academic culture that exists from the Harvard Graduate School to 3rd grade in Flagstaff, Arizona, which is a kind of animus against American institutions, kind of animus against the American achievement, a kind of curdled view of American history, and parents are tired of it. I'm not saying that all the people protesting are thoughtful. I'm not saying they're all right, but I'm saying there are real grounds for grievances about what is being taught their children. When a child comes home at age 7 and says, "Mommy, I'm guilty of white privilege," parents throw their hands up and say, "This is my tax dollars at work?" I don't think so. So we have been fighting about school curricula since the 19th century, since before that, really, but basically the 19th century, over what prayers would be said in school back when we said prayers in school, to teaching biology in Dayton, Tennessee, in the Scopes trial. We've been doing this for many years, and it's not unhealthy. Again, we want parents to pay attention to their schools. And I'm afraid when Mr. McAuliffe says, I've known Terry for many years, our children are in the same school. Terry says, "I sent my 5 children to school, not to public schools." You didn't, Terry, but that's another matter. When Terry McAuliffe says we don't want parents telling teachers what to teach, parents say, "Well, the Supreme Court differs." The Supreme Court, in a famous case in the 1920s, says parents have a right to resist the state trying to standardize their children. And as I say, I think it's healthy to have parents coming out to school board meetings and saying, "We don't like what we're hearing."
Hi. You spoke about government being the need for it to be strong enough to secure rights, but not so strong that it can topple rights. Right now, the Supreme Court is hearing arguments on SB 8 and the abortion law in Texas. What are your thoughts if they uphold SB 8, thus opening the way for governments to offload their responsibility of securing rights and kind of empowering this majority that you speak about to impose various restrictions?
Yeah, that Texas law, they had the oral arguments on it today, and the oral arguments were not about abortion, had nothing to do with abortion. It had to do with, can you design a cynical law that its whole purpose is to avoid judicial review in the federal courts? And I think that the 9 fine minds, and there are no dummies on our Supreme Court, the 9 fine minds on the Supreme Court may have 9 different reasons for coming to the same conclusion, but I think they're going to come to the same conclusion, that this is not acceptable. So Texas didn't. The Dobbs case out of Mississippi is a big deal. And the oral arguments are on the 1st of December, and it's going to be fascinating. I can't say more than that because no one knows. No one knows why they took the case, but it's going to be hilarious.
You've mentioned several times about things that end up at the Supreme Court, and we all know that there's, most sessions there's not enough time for all the cases that are deserving to be heard. But I'm wondering if you have an opinion, and there seems to be quite a few different opinions these days. But I'm wondering what your opinion is on the current size and structure of the Supreme Court. Do you think that's an institution that could be improved through some kind of revamping, restructuring?
Well, the gloomy side of me says most improvements make matters worse. I certainly think packing the Supreme Court would be a calamitous measure, because that would ratify the, in my view, quite mistaken sense that the Supreme Court is just politicians in robes, which is just not right. I don't think anyone on the left, right, or center is accurately described that way. And if someone said, well, good, let's add 4, let's take it up to 13, we'll add 4 justices, and then we'll have, the next time someone come in and say, no, we're going to run it up to 19. It would just make matters worse. Look, some people win and some people lose, and the Supreme Court changes over time. Franklin Roosevelt wanted to pack the Supreme Court, and the country's reaction, and by the way, he had His party overwhelmingly controlled both houses of Congress at the time, and Congress could do that. He suffered such a stinging defeat in the 1938 elections because of this. There wasn't a liberal legislative majority in Congress again until 1965, after the anti-Goldwater landslide. I say with some bitterness because I voted for Barry, but that's enough. Anyway, will there be another constitutional amendment ever? Yeah, I'm sure there will be. We don't want to amend it often because most amendments are preposterous. And the more you amend it, the less people will venerate the Constitution. I'm in favor of two that will never be passed. One is term limits for national legislators. And so they'll think of the next generation rather than the next election. And I think it is now possible to devise a workable balanced budget amendment. But I don't hold on. It's hard to amend the Constitution, and it ought to be.
My perception is that the nation is currently run by three parties. There's the Democrats, certainly to the left. There's a small number of Republicans left. And there's the Trumplicans, which are a rotten crowd. Now, we are both registered as Democrats. I, for one, only because in Pennsylvania, in order to vote in the primaries, you have to be registered in one party or the other. I would love to see a centrist party come into existence, one that would marginalize the far left and even more so the far right. Do you think that that would be a good idea, and whether it is a possible, is it a rational thought? Even?
Well, it'd be a good idea, but it'd also be a good idea if lobsters grew on trees. But here's the problem. The Republican Party was a third party, and it became the second party that has framed our presidential competition since 1856 because the Whig Party collapsed. I do not think the Republican Party is going to collapse, but third parties have an extremely difficult time for a number of reasons, not the least of which is the winner-take-all allocation of electoral votes by the states, which 48 states do, all but Maine and Nebraska. What that means is you can be Ross Perot in 1992, get 19.7% of the popular vote, essentially 1 in 5 popular vote went to Perot, but he got no electoral votes. Successful third parties have three things in common. They fail, but every once in a while they win electoral votes. George Wallace won electoral votes. Strom Thurmond won electoral votes in 48, Wallace in 68. Because they had a vivid personality, a single burning issue, and a regional base. But that's not the basis of a national party going forward over time. That's something just attached to a vivid person. So I think people are going to try with the third party, I think, in 2024, particularly if he who shall not be named runs again. And that'll be good to give people an outlet for their steam. But I don't think it's a way to capture the institutions of this country. I could be wrong. I have been once or twice before.